If your Miata suspension is feeling worn out and worn down, kind of like I'm feeling after doing this huge job, then this might be just the episode for you. Welcome back to the Auto Obsessive Garage. Chadwick with you again for another installment of Project Mariner Blueberry. And this one's an action-packed suspension extravaganza, guys. If your Miata is not riding the way it should, especially if it has high mileage or just, wasn't really kept up on its maintenance with its suspension components, then you're gonna wanna follow along. This guy behind me needed a lot of work to get to where it sits right now. And I'm gonna walk you guys through that process. You cannot just throw coilovers and sway bars at an old Miata and say, man, this thing handles like a dream, because it won't. The underlying suspension issues will not have been addressed. I guarantee on your higher mileage Miata, even if you threw cool coilovers on it, it probably still has worn out ball joints, control arms are just perished beyond all recognition. I'm sure the outer tie rods also are just open and been out of grease for years. So guys, this is a great episode. We are upgrading as we're doing this operation, because if you are upgrading your shocks and springs and sway bars and end links, this is the time to do it. But this is volume 1 of the suspension extravaganza. Let's go revisit the massive amount of work it took to fix this bad boy suspension up. See you in the garage. Here's a sneak peek on the driver's side, what we are working towards today, guys. And as you can see, there's a lot of stuff removed here. Let me give you a better look. You can see, obviously, the shock is completely out. The lower control arm's still there, but you can see that the ball joint has been removed. Also, the outer tie rod has been removed. Our brake rotor and wheel hub are supported on jack stands, which you should do to keep tension off that brake line. We are ultimately gonna do brakes, but I'm gonna do that after we get this all back together. I think it'll be a lot easier to break those bolts loose, swap over the disc and everything when the hub's actually mounted up to the suspension. But you can see the upper control arm's totally gone, the end link's gone on the sway bar, and that's what we're going for, guys, because it takes a lot. I mean, you can see it's all empty in here. So we're gonna have to do that on the passenger side, so that's what we're working towards. Back to reality. Here's the passenger side of the vehicle. You can see we still have our Tahiko shocks with racing beat springs. We are going to be taking that out. The upper control arm with all its worn bushings, that guy's coming out. Our old style racing beat sway bar. I might actually paint that because it's just got a little bit of corrosion on it and paint it red like the new ones, which is pretty cool because I do have the end links, the new racing beat end links to go on. And as you can see, it still has the racing beat. I don't know if you can pick the red up there on that bushing, but it still has the racing beat mounts. So we'll keep those, but we'll take the whole bar down, probably paint it, make it look cool. But for the most part, yeah, all this is coming out. So you can see we have a lot of work to do back here. Some of this is a pain in the butt. I'm gonna show you a logical order if you are taking everything out. There are some things you're gonna wanna do, like the big bolts, like at the end of the upper control arm and lower control arm. You're gonna want resistance on those. So maybe doing those bolts first. We'll see what we can do. It was a real pain in the butt to do it all when I had loosened up everything, so. Yeah, 230,000 plus miles. You're gonna get a lot of resistance when you're breaking a lot of these bolts loose. You should probably soak in PB Blast or penetrating oil. I've done the same. Every little bit helps. So let's get in there and start working on this bad boy. So we've got the sway bar out of the way. You can see the gnarly end link back here, still there. We'll get that when we have more time to access it. We do have to take this upper control arm off right here. And there's a castle nut underneath this. We need to pull a cotter pin that hasn't been touched for 230,000 miles. I don't want to make you guys endure having to watch me struggle with that for a half hour or so. So we'll just kind of breeze through that, but that's what you're gonna do. You're gonna wanna pull this one first, this castle nut. There's also a castle nut on the lower control arm near where the ball joint is, and you're gonna wanna get that too. Secondly, you are gonna remove these two bolts that has the huge rod in the back there for the upper control arm. So you can take that assembly down. At that point, you will be able to lower this down. I'll take the outer tie rod off to it this time since we are replacing the outer tie rod. So that'll allow the whole suspension to drop down, easily removing the shock and spring setup. Make life a lot easier, and then we'll remove the rest of the components. But those big castle nuts, you want to do those first while you still have some resistance. If you do these two bolts and then want to do the castle nut last, it's really challenging because they're on there really tight, and this control arm will just flop around. Same with the lower control arm. You want to do that before you remove everything else. So I'm going to do those two next, and then we'll start taking apart the rest of this stuff. I'll show you anything I come up with along the way, but you're just undoing everything, so just do it in a logical order where you have resistance where you need it for your really tough stuff. So let's do that. Actually, might take that tie rod off right now. Let's go ahead and do that. There's a castle nut right up there. We're gonna pull that cotter pin out, pull the castle nut off, and then slam you can see the bushing. Look how perished this is. This is probably been dead for 10 years. I mean, you can see it's just split open, no more grease in there. So we're gonna use our pickle fork, slam in there. It doesn't matter, we're not gonna damage anything that's not already damaged. Cause the separation there, go ahead and drop that tie rod down, and then we'll have access to get to the other bolts in there a little easier. So let's do revised order of attack. Let's knock this tie rod out, then we'll do these castle nuts for the upper and lower control arms, then we'll take the rest of the upper control arm off, and then we'll take the lower perch bolt off for the suspension back there. You can see where he connects right there, right in the center of the screen, nice and framed up. That's what we're gonna be doing next. And that way when we do drop, the suspension is gonna drop down, pick up that strut, and then pull it straight out. Things are never fun when your cotter pins look like this. A big, slimy, rusty, horrible situation. They're all gonna look like this after 200,000 miles. And this isn't even a rust area car, this is a California car, so you guys in those salty climates, those wintry climates, you're gonna have fun with this part. So take your time. You don't want this thing to break off and make it worse than you need it to, so just keep trying. I use a combination of pliers and little small flathead screwdrivers, and eventually tapped it out. So this is the cotter pin to the outer tie rod. Many more to come. Update, friends. We got the outer tie rod off, which you can see I have it marked right there so we can get the replacement tie rod on there as close as we can. Okay, next thing we're gonna do is undo this upper control arm castle nut. Pulling that pin out will be super fun. Same with the lower control arm castle nut and pin. And then we're gonna have to support the hub and brake rotor, this whole assembly, with some jack stands so it's not just hanging out. And then we'll have access to the shock here. We'll be able to undo that bolt, pull the shock right down through. We gotta remember there's two bolts up top there we need to undo from the top side where that shock won't be going anywhere. And then of course the last thing we're gonna do, undo these two bolts back there for the upper control arm since we are removing that unit completely. All right, with the castle nut off the lower control arm and the castle nut off the upper control arm, before you use a pickle fork or any other remover to pull those off, it's a good time to go ahead and release the strut with its lower strut bolt there. We'll go ahead and do that, and we'll loosen the two bolts up there. That way when this assembly drops, we can easily get that out of there. So here's the next order of operation. Loosen these bolts on either side. Boop, boop. Let's take that out. There's a bolt going through there with a nut on the end. We'll take that out. We'll loosen the two tiny bolts up under the hood, get that nice and loose, and then we're gonna use our pickle fork, pop these ones off. We'll pop the top one first, and then we'll pop the bottom one, and we should be good. Once you get the nut off that lower strut perch, you're gonna use a hammer, and basically, I'm doing this left-handed. I'm gonna tap it up nice and easy. Now once it gets inside the lower part of the strut itself, you're gonna wanna use something. I usually use a nail punch or something with a broader tip so you're not doing too much damage. There's nothing that can go too wrong here. Obviously if it's seized up or rusted in there, you're not gonna wanna force it. You're gonna wanna use some other measures, but this works pretty good. I'll put that punch right there and kind of just hammer her out. Under the hood now, I wanna show you the two bolts we're gonna be doing. There's a 14mm on the left side here. Then under these wires, there's another 14mm. Just gonna loosen those and that'll allow the strut to be loose. With the upper control arm released from the front, from the wheel hub assembly, it's time to do these big bolts back here. These can be on there pretty dang tight. There's a nut and a bolt on each side. Let me get mine on this side. You can see this guy right here. Yeah, so those can be honked down pretty tight, especially if they haven't moved in years. Get ready for a workout. Go ahead and knock those out. I do believe they're 21 millimeter. Yep, 21 millimeter. So that's what you need. You need to put a 21 millimeter on one side, 21 on the other, and spin those off any way you can. I usually use a breaker bar and hold the other end, but. All right, back to the upper control arm. Once you get that nut off the end, you're gonna be in the same situation you were with the lower strut. You need to push this bolt. It's a very long bolt all the way through, so you can use a hammer to tap it in, and then it should be loose enough to wiggle out. All right, it is a little tricky here with this little piece that connects to the front of the vehicle, so you might have to work around that, finagle a little bit, but it'll come. All right, now we're looking a lot better in here. We got the strut out. Strut assembly was pretty easy, and then pulled the upper control arm out, so we have a lot of space now. Now it's just time to get a pickle fork in here or some other kind of puller. If you're having to remove something from your ball joint, you're trying to save your ball joint, you don't want to jam a pickle fork in there because it'll cut the boot up. But as you can see, the boot is already split wide open. So that's why we're doing all this work, guys. To put shocks or struts or sway bars or anything fun on this car and then not address these bigger issues would be ridiculous to even think about improving the handling or the ride quality of this vehicle. This is why we do what we do. So let's pickle fork this, get this bad boy off. Shouldn't be too hard. And then we're done. We just basically need to clean everything up and start installing new parts. All right, we got the lower control arm separated from the hub, and you are looking at our ball joint here, which looks to be in horrible condition. So to get the ball joint off of the car, it's not too hard. You got a large bolt that goes through here. Just loosen this nut, slide it out, same as we've been doing. And there's another hidden bolt. You can see it down in there. That guy you're gonna wanna get loose. I'm a big fan of taking him out first while you still have these bolts on the end so this thing isn't flopping around too much. But let's go ahead and get that old ball joint off of there. All right, I've got the nut off this side of the ball joint. We're just gonna pull this bolt out. A little bit crusty, but not the worst thing I've ever seen. And your ball joint now should just come on out. It should slide right out of the end of your lower control arm. Might need some motivational speaking to get it to slide out. Boom, there you go. Whew. You think it's time for a new ball joint, guys? I don't know. Now we match the driver's side. So, time to clean everything up in here and get ready to install our all new suspension parts. We are at the rear of the Miata now, and it looks a lot less complicated. Go figure, there's no steering components. But I want to be brutally honest with you guys, I had so much of a wrestling match to do the rear on the other side. I want to show you some of the common issues. Pretty simple when you think about it. To get the strut assembly out, you really just need to loosen the upper control arm bolt here. You gotta take the end links off your sway bar. That's pretty much it, except for this bolt right here. It has a captive nut inside the lower control arm. How brilliant of a design is that? So in practice, it should, or in theory, not in practice, it should screw out just fine. But what happens is that captive nut, where it mounts to the, or where it holds the bolt, always comes loose. So you'll get the screw to move a little bit and then it'll just spin freely. And that is scary. So I'll show you what I did on the other side to make it accessible. Because you're gonna need to secure that captive nut because it's no longer being a captive nut if the bolt is spinning freely. So you're gonna have to hold that captive nut with a wrench and get it off. But before that, the other issue. Oh my gosh. So I'll show you the driver's side since I've already done that. And now your suspension mount, you can just imagine if the suspension was still back there. You can see I got rid of the filler hose here for the fuel filler, just to get that little bit of access. One of the studs on the suspension sheared off, so that was super fun, but you already have an accessibility issue trying to reach back there. So that's gonna be fun. Now on the passenger side, a little more accessible. These wires can be moved out of the way and you have two pretty small 14mm bolts to access. Let me zoom in a little bit. There you go, one there, one there. Now you can see they are pretty crusty looking, and this is not a rusty Miata. This is a Miata that had some issues with water pooling in the trunk at one point. So that's kind of an issue. That's a big deal. And this low point in the suspension means these things were submerged. Try to get some light on it. There you go. Look at that crusty bad boy. So yeah, good chance those are gonna break. Pain in the butt to access those. The rear is not fun. It's less complicated for sure, but not fun so far. Oh yeah, what I was gonna show you under the driver's side. Can you guys see my little window? See this little cut here? I cut that, folded it back, and that way I can get a wrench up there. So you cannot get a wrench up on this side of the strut brace because it's too tight. They did not make the hole in the lower control arm big enough to fit a wrench up. So I cut some little slivers. Could have done that in one cut. Next time I'll get it right. But you can see the two flaps there. And I just folded them back with some channel locks. So obviously when I put the strut back in, I'm gonna have to hold the captive nut with that 17mm wrench, which works great, and tighten it all the way onto spec. And then I'm gonna fold those up with a hammer and hammer it back into place. It didn't jeopardize the lower control arm. These are very small cuts. So, and I kept as much material and we can bend it back in shape. But yeah, just so you know, that's what you're gonna have to do possibly. Rear suspension, after I just gave you that complete overview, let's talk about our order of operation now. So first thing we're gonna attack is the end link bolts. We'll just take those off, probably drop the sway bar altogether. We are putting new end links on both sides, so we'll just drop all that eventually. That'll get some slack on this lower control arm. Next thing we're probably gonna do, we could do that bolt that holds the lower shock in place, and that way we'll know if we have to make that window underneath to get to the captive bolt or not. So we might as well front load that fun operation. Then last, we can do the two bolts holding the strut through the trunk, and that'll free up the suspension, but we're still gonna need to lower this control arm down. So this is the best way to do it. Remove this long bolt here on the upper control arm, and that'll give us enough room to pivot this all down and get the strut out of there. How's that sound, guys? Sounds like a blast. Let's go ahead and knock it out. Here are the two top strut mounts for the Miata in my hand. Those nuts look a little interesting, kind of like there's still a stud inside of them. That's because both of them sheared off. Look how absolutely crusty they are. So yeah, at one point this Miata trunk clearly had some water hanging out. Those struts are kind of down in a low spot, so that's my thought, because the rest of the car isn't rusty at all. So the trunks, I know these Miatas can gain water in the trunk if the drains aren't cleared out. So here's what happens, guys. Your suspension nuts sit in water and get nice and crusty. I'm getting new shock mounts at all four corners. That should improve overall handling too, and I don't have to worry about the bolts being rusty. Here, I wanted to show you the bolt that I'm talking about. So here's your lower strut bolt right there. You can see it through the control arm. And what happens, there is a little cutout here, but you spin it and you can see this. This is pretty hard to capture, so let me light up my light. Can you guys see in here? You can see this little reflection in there. That is, this part down here is the captive nut. And if I put my impact on it, I'll show you what's happening here. You're gonna see that captive nut. And that's no good. That'll spin forever and you'll never get that bolt out. So what I need to do is cut. You can see my outline I've already done. Take a Dremel or similar cutting thing. You don't want to cut too deep in there and take out too much structure, but just enough. And this really isn't that big of an area if you really zoom out and see, but here you go. We're gonna cut out that area and fold it back, and that way I can get a 17mm open-ended wrench in there, and then you can hold that while you spin off the bolt. Now, here's what that captive nut looks like. It's kind of just a square. Again, you can fit a 17mm open-end wrench over this, and that's what you're gonna use. You can keep pushing the bolt outward with like a screwdriver or a pry bar. And let me show you what I'm talking about. So you can see in here now. So you can see the bolt up in there. The end of the bolt right there, you can see her. Now what you're gonna wanna do is kind of push on that with a screwdriver, push the bolt out on this side. This guy right here. So by prying on that, using a pry bar or a screwdriver, you should be able to pull this out. It can be on there pretty good. So just push that out and you should be fine. You can pull that bolt out and then your suspension should be free. Now that we've got the lower strut mount bolt out, we simply move up here to the upper control arm and we just need to remove this bolt and nut combination going through here. So again, PB Blaster is your friend. Let's go ahead and pull that out, and then we should be able to drop the assembly down and pull this strut loose. Okay, once you get this nut off of that upper control arm, we just need to tap this bolt through. Sometimes you can kind of get it to come out a little bit with the impact. Maybe we don't need to tap this one through. Got it pretty far there. And then you can just kind of wiggle it out, even though it's gonna have the weight of the suspension on it. So what I'm gonna do now is use, again, this little guy here, this center punch, or whatever you wanna call it, nail punch. Put it on the bolt, just pound it through with a hammer and it should pop it out. Our suspension should lower at that point. And here's that upper control arm bolt removed. So time to get this whole assembly to drop down a little bit. We can just apply some weight and we should be able to pull the strut right down. There we go. The strut is now free. Last but not least, we're going to release this last bolt on the end link. And then we'll take off the remaining 4 bolts that attach the sway bar to the chassis of the car to remove that fully. And we will be done taking apart the suspension on this car. Can't wait to put it all back together. A lot of work to do, guys.